The book of 1 Timothy chapter number 5 tonight, and we continue our discussion on the importance of godly relationships and using those as a means to impact the kingdom of God in the way that He would have us to do so. We saw already a relationship to the individuals in verses 1 and 2, and we're in a larger section of Scripture that is pertaining to our relationship as a church to widows. And we have already seen the importance of assessing the need with discernment. And then we saw last time to assist the qualified with compassion. We want to move on this evening into verses 11 through 13 and notice the point to reject the disqualified with consistency. The logical consequence of accepting some widows to be supported is that others are going to have to be rejected. You're going to say yes to some, and you're going to say no to others. Paul's writing in this entire section of instruction is to provide guidance and a standard by which these kinds of decisions could be made. And I would say that without a doubt, the leaders in the church at Ephesus would have faced a tremendous challenge by weighing the desire to help somebody against the wisdom of helping somebody. Sometimes our compassion reaches out and we say, well, I want to. Sometimes our desire to is actually not what is best. Those are difficult decisions to make. The reality is that we are faced with those kinds of decisions often. Sometimes we're faced with those kinds of decisions within our own homes. A child, for example, who perhaps makes a mess of his life, now has one phone call to be able to make outside to civilization. And he makes that phone call to his parents and says, I just got arrested for breaking such and such a law. Will you come bail me out? That's a hard thing to decide as a parent. There's the side that says, I want to. There's the other side that says that's not what's best. Sometimes as parents or perhaps grandparents or great-grandparents, the challenge becomes even harder. Grandparents can't stand the thought of grandchildren struggling or hurting or going through some sort of circumstance that is unfortunate. It's easy to allow our compassion and our sympathy to outweigh the wisdom and actually in some cases become detrimental to what it is that is trying to happen. At some point in time, a person has to learn to manage his own money and function within what his own checks allow. If you constantly bail someone out financially, you're doing them a greater disservice. But that's a hard call to make. I mean, let's just be honest. It's a fact. But sometimes the biggest lessons are learned the hard way. I learned the power of an electric fence, not because I sat down and read the manual. I touched it, okay? In fact, I was the dumb enough kid to touch it on multiple occasions. I've been shocked by those on numerous occasions. Guess what? Each time hurts. It leaves an unforgettable impression on your mind. Don't touch an electric fence. If someone insists on touching an electric fence, fine, touch it. It's going to hurt. Okay? And it's going to. Sometimes the best incentive to prepare a budget is to miss a meal. Okay? Or two. Or eat rice and beans for several meals. Who knows, whatever the case might be. I'm not advocating that we be cruel, but what I am saying is we also have to exercise discernment. And these leaders in Ephesus were undoubtedly, based on the amount of material that he gives to this and the detail in the instruction, some of the commands to stop doing this, some of the commands to continuously do this, I think it's fairly safe to say that they were facing a challenge. And Paul realized that. And so he gives them some guidance. How do we reject this person? How do we do so properly? Well, number one, before we get into the text, an objective standard must be consistently applied. Any time that assistance is considered, it has to be viewed not solely on the emotional basis. The need has to be based on objective standards that are truly in the best interests of the one who's needing assistance. I've unfortunately had to do this sometimes in how we choose to perhaps provide assistance for someone. Okay? The need is there and the desire to be able to help is there, but sometimes that person needs to learn principles of good stewardship and financial management. To continually throw money at that same problem does not help. It actually enables a lifestyle that is going to become more detrimental in the long run. Sometimes, in fact, I'd say oftentimes, the best interests may not be apparent in the short-range goal, but it's often going to be considered in the long range. So when we look at the standards, we have to say, what is going to benefit this person ultimately by trying to look ahead and see the long-term results? Then we run into the consistent aspect of this, because the natural tendency is to want to bend the rules, especially if it's someone who is liked. Now, if it's someone who isn't liked, and of course we would never have any of those people in our lives, these kinds of rules are very convenient. Oh, I'm sorry, it's not my fault, Paul said so. Okay? But then there's that one we all really, really like. Oh, maybe we should go ahead and just create an exception. So many times those exceptions become problems. And, sometimes you just, sometimes I dread answering questions. It's like, because the answer to that's no. Oh, it just seems so cruel. Yeah, it probably does. We'll try to paint it nicely, but it because of the exception that it's going to create. Maybe someone's close to 60. Remember, letting out a widow under 80 years of age, being, well, she's 58. What do? You bend the rules? Or do you stay consistent with it? Well, my oldest child, I'm not literally speaking of my children, but I guess you could use that example. She's got to be home at such and such a time, and then, well, I like my middle child more, and so, it's okay. You can be out. Do you see the inconsistency there? And it is a nightmare. But those kinds of things happen frequently, and we need to try to eliminate these things across the board in our own lives. It is important to note that the qualifications, as we've mentioned, are not intended on creating different social classes. Let's say it this way. A qualified widow is not superior, nor is a disqualified widow inferior. Okay? These are just simply facts. We're not saying that this person's character is automatically bad. Number two, a disqualified widow is not automatically an ungodly widow. She might be, but she may not be. In fact, in many of the cases, she probably is not. So we're not going to say that it's exclusively based on the character. That's obviously possible for someone to have a character that is not fitting, but it is also equally possible that a godly widow be disqualified based solely on her age. So it doesn't mean that we are insulting this person's character, or that we are somehow viewing them negatively or advocating that we treat them negatively. The standards are giving us a precaution, really, from making a decision that she might later regret. So that leads us then to the bulk of the message, and that's point number 3. Younger widows are to be rejected. Okay, notice verse 11. But the younger widows refuse. For when they have begun to wax wanton against Christ, they will marry, having damnation, because they have cast off their first faith. And withal they learn to be idle, wandering about from house to house. And not only idle, but tattlers also, and busybodies, speaking things which they ought not. So here's the instruction, the command: the younger widows refuse. We're not looking at this as something that is merely optional. This is something that is a command. It demands obedience. Refuse, continuously reject them. Do not put them on the list of widows who are eligible for support. We look at the word reject and we say, well, that's extremely harsh. I don't think we should be that harsh. Doesn't mean, by the way, there's nothing that indicates the demeanor with which they're to be rejected has to be done harshly. But when it all comes down to it, here's the reality: do not do this with the younger widows. There are some individuals, and I've alluded to this in previous messages, but some individuals do not like being told no. In fact, we are living in a society that is becoming increasingly more entitled. It's a problem. We are suggesting that all of this assistance, and it's not just desired anymore, it's expected anymore. I have college debt. I shouldn't have to pay for that. Well, why do I have to pay for your college debt? You see? We've got ideas out there and say, well, I can go and spend beyond my means and all I have to do is declare bankruptcy. This is how people function today. It's your responsibility to provide for me. What happened to it's your responsibility to provide for you? And our society is going to crumble if we continue down this path of entitlement. It is an unbiblical concept. And it ought not to just simply be passed over as all of this is fine. And it's a challenge, but yeah, you work hard for everything you have. That's called life. And it's time that some people begin to understand this concept. But they say, well, I expect this assistance, and then if you tell me no, you're cruel or you're inhumane. Just because someone disagrees with something or perhaps is even upset over a decision that is made does not mean that that decision was wrong. Every time my child was punished for disobedience, they disagreed with it. Okay? They weren't happy about it. They were upset over it. They cried. Does that mean I was wrong? No. Did they like being sent to their room and say, wow, Dad, thank you for that. That is a valuable lesson for me. No. Did they always do so with the right attitude? No, and that resulted in further punishment. But did they ever, get a spanking and look back and say, wow, thank you, Dad, that really means a lot to me that you care so much for me? Doesn't happen that way. Does that mean that level of discipline is inappropriate? No, it does not. Okay? Does it mean because a 16-year-old child is told, no, you can't drive a car, that decision is wrong? No. Are they going to accept it? Probably not. Okay? And this idea that this is because it's disagreed or you said no, it's inhumane and cruel. Good stewardship demands that these resources be spent within certain limitations, regardless of a perceived need. And God said, you know what? Widows who are younger than 60 are not to be given the support. That's the standard. So, why is that the case? And Paul gives us some reasons for this. There are 3 of them that we will look at. Number 1, 2 of them. Rejection is based on the potential resolve to remarry. Notice verse 11. The younger widows refuse. 4, here's the explanation. When they have begun to wax wanton against Christ, they will marry. That phrase, when they have begun to wax wanton, describes a time that would be whenever they might be governed by the strong desire to remarry. That's a natural God-given desire. There's nothing wrong with that desire. They have the impulse. It's not saying they're going to, it's whenever they might. There's a potential that this is going to occur. And it is more likely to occur with a younger widow than it is to an older widow. There's nothing wrong with a desire, but if a desire occurs, we're not saying that she's in violation of the Word of God, but then that phrase says it's against Christ. It literally means that it will separate them from Christ. That does not mean that they are guilty of living a carnal lifestyle or of abandoning Christ. Here's the implication. They made an oath to remain single and devote themselves to Christ. We'll see that here in just a little bit. But their natural impulses put them in a dilemma. They made this oath sincerely, but their natural instincts put them into a dilemma that now forces them, am I going to remarry or am I going to remain loyal to this oath? Paul says, here's the result. When this desire takes place, they will marry. There's a resolve that they are going to marry. And then he explains the result of it. Having damnation, because they have cast off their first faith. And when we think of damnation, we think of eternal condemnation. Let's use a different phrase that would mean the same thing. Having condemning judgment. Why would they have a condemning judgment? Because they've cast off their first faith. Does not mean they disowned Christ. It means instead that they have rejected or they have in some way disowned this first promise. That would be the word I'm looking for. Promise to be faithful and loyal. Here's what happens. These ladies who lost their husband vow that they would remain single and devote themselves to the service of Christ. Very noble. So the church would immediately now support them. And Paul says, no, don't do that. Because here's the problem. As they continue in life, their desire to remarry is going to become stronger and stronger and stronger. And eventually, they're going to remarry and forget the oath that they made. So the wisdom is this. Look long term and don't put them into this kind of a dilemma. Marriage, we know, is an institution that is designed by God. It's intended to be one man and one woman until death. Now, let me just say that regardless of culture's opinion, God's standard has always been the same, and it will remain that way. It doesn't matter what mankind might say. The married couple experiences a difficulty that the single person does not. Now, the single person experiences difficulties the married couples do not. 1 Corinthians 7 talks extensively about this. In fact, Paul says, I wish that everyone were single as myself. He goes through in 1 Corinthians 7 the essence of marriage, the demands that it entails. He teaches God's perspective on the matters of divorce and remarriage. And then he encourages believers, regardless of your social status, you are to serve the Lord with seriousness because the time is short. And it remaineth that though they be, that both they that be have wives be as though they had none. In other words, there's a seriousness that ought to characterize our lives regardless of whether we are married or single. Then he goes on in 1 Corinthians 7 and he states this, but I would have you without carefulness, he that is unmarried careth for the things that belong to the Lord, how he may please the Lord. But he that is married careth for the things that are of the world, how he may please his wife. There is difference also between a wife and a virgin. The unmarried woman careth for the things of the Lord, that she may be holy both in body and in spirit. But she that is married careth for the things of the world, how she may please her husband. Is Paul saying in this passage, if you're married, you should not be focusing on pleasing your spouse? Absolutely not. But what he is saying is, when you are married, there is this reality that you have a, let's say, divided allegiance. You love your wife, you love your spouse, and there's caring for her, and then there's also your ability to serve the Lord. Now, doesn't mean that you divorce so that you can go serve the Lord freely, okay? And he alludes to this in 1 Corinthians 7. But it is still a reality. With that passage in mind, in 1 Timothy 5, what Paul is recognizing is, here are these widows who said, you know what, now I don't have these responsibilities and I can devote myself wholly in service to the Lord. But if she declares her oath that she makes invalid and gets away from it, now she's wrong, because she made a promise that she is not keeping. So the leaders of that church can say, you know what? We can avoid this dilemma with an age restriction on this. Do it this way. Those who were supported by the church devoted themselves exclusively to the ministry. And they might initially claim that they have this kind of a passion, and this is when the leaders of the church have to step in and say, no on this. It doesn't mean that she can't serve the Lord, okay? But she's not going to be eligible for this kind of support. It continues then into the second reason that he alludes to as to why they're to be rejected, verse 13. And withal they learn to be idle, wandering about from house to house, and not only idle, but tattlers also, and busybodies, speaking things which they ought not. Withal means at the same time. So at the same time they desire to remarry, they also learn to be idle. Kind of interesting thing. Behavior is a learned pattern. Remember, Paul said, I have learned in whatsoever state I am therewith to be content. Okay? It's not everyone else's fault. It's how you choose to function. But in this case, this particular pattern of behavior that is learned is very detrimental. Their being unemployed by the church and supported by the church has become detrimental to their character. They have too much time. Notice what the Bible says. They learn to be idle, and they are guilty of wandering about from house to house. They're going about from house to house, and they have no purpose or direction. They have too much time on their hands. Have you ever noticed that too much time generally becomes detrimental? Okay? It's okay to take breaks from things, but too much time becomes detrimental. Perhaps you have started a project and then gone inside and sat down where it's nice and cool. And the longer you sit, the less likely that project is actually going to get done today. Okay, it can become very detrimental. Now, rather than using that time to engage in behavior, they actually engaged in ungodly and even detrimental behavior. And it's even quite possible, in fact, I'd say probable, that the nature of their ministry to which they committed themselves encompassed going from house to house in ministry. That's what they were doing. But after time, the ministry became less beneficial and more detrimental because their focus started to shift. Notice what happens. They were not only guilty of being idle, not employed, but they were also guilty of being tattlers, also in busybody. Tattlers is another word for gossips. Busybodies describes people who engage in matters that do not concern them. They are nosy. You know, some things aren't your business. You ever figured that out in life? Okay? It's quite interesting. Rather than engaging in behavior that is beneficial, they're engaged in things that don't pertain to them. Such meddlesome behavior often occurs with those who have too much idle time. You remember this was the problem when we studied in 1 Thessalonians? This was the problem with the church in Thessalonica. Here was Paul's admonition to them. You should study to be quiet, to do your own business, to work with your own hands, as we commanded you. In other words, Paul says, get back to work. Stop saying we're going to be unemployed because the day of the Lord is about to come, so we're just going to be unemployed. Paul says, no. Get back to work and mind your own business. Great advice today. The solution, as Paul says, is to be busy about doing what God has called you to do. If you are constantly engaged in the business of others, I want to challenge you to learn that kind of behavior is detrimental. Focus on yourself. If you haven't figured it out yet, you have enough problems to deal with. But it also this kind of behavior naturally leads to inappropriate speech. So they engage in tattlers also. They're busy by speaking things which they ought not. You shouldn't be talking this way. It's a natural byproduct of people who are engaged in everyone else's business. James chapter 3, James writes this, out of the same mouth proceedeth blessing and cursing. My brethren, these things ought not so to be. Regardless of the format in which your words take place, internet, Facebook, text, or verbal, this kind of speech is inappropriate. This kind of speech should be avoided. Paul says you need to reject the younger widows. Why? Because they're going to have a desire to remarry. Secondly, you need to reject them based on the reality of idleness and what it's going to cause. Stay focused on the task at hand. Don't be engaged in detrimental behavior. If we just simply took the admonition of verse 13 and wisely applied it to our own lives, I wonder how focused we would be in our Christian walk. Don't worry about what everyone else is doing. Did you see what so-and-so said on Facebook? No? Honestly. Do I care? Probably not. Maybe should, but I probably don't. You know, I'm amazed at young with adults, grown men, some twice my age, how busy they get in everyone else's jobs. And it was almost comical. I'll close with this illustration. Last night I did a concert at Biltmore, and we have probably, 20, 25 buses up there doing a summer concert at Biltmore. And most of the time we're shuttling from lot to lot to lot to lot. And that's just what we do. It's lovely. You just drive around in a circle, okay? It's awful. Anyway, I picked up a group actually from another location. I was not working for Biltmore. I picked up another group and brought them to the concert. So I was not involved in the round and round and round and round we go. So I went to and was instructed to go where they were all parked waiting to be told to go round and round and round and round, and I just sat there and parked. You should have seen the looks I got. What's he doing sitting over there? He must be laying out. I was waiting for someone to just come and ask, and it's a good thing they didn't, because I was going to just tell them, I just told the dispatcher I wasn't going to do it. And just let it run. Just let that wildfire take off. And it would have. It would have been ablazing. It would have been blazing 5 minutes after I said it. And just see who all actually believes that. What's the reality? You know what? I had a job to do and they had a job to do. Do your job and I'll do mine. It'd be amazing if Christians took that same approach. If we refused to engage in business that does not pertain to us. Man, I can think of a lot of problems that would be solved. I can think of many counseling sessions that would never have occurred if people would have minded their own business. It's very simple. So if you're one that's in the business of others, let me challenge you to study to be quiet. If you're one that finds blessing and cursing comes out of your mouth, let me challenge you to realize God's perspective on it. Shouldn't happen. It's not appropriate.